Good morning, participants. How are you? I hope you've had a couple of great sessions and I really enjoyed the keynote. So if you're out there and you're with me, just go ahead and give me a good morning in the chat box. I want us to kind of utilize the chat box to communicate with one another, just to get some feedback. That way we don't have to speak out, but we can definitely, we've got this really small setting here that we can talk about the standards for mathematical practices. So I want us to take advantage of that, and we'll use our chat box to do that. So thank you.
And our presenter is Kim Sparkman, and she's with KEDC. She's going to be talking to us today about the standards for mathematics. And the session title is Standards for Mathematical Practice Walkthrough Tool from a Student's Perspective. And Kim, thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us today. And as she said, she will be using the chat for questions and comments and interacting throughout the presentation. So welcome, everyone.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here and talk just a few minutes about our standards for mathematical practices. We have 30 minutes, but we could spend days on these. So I want to just dive into it real quick. And I know if we're not like living in those standards, then we may have kind of gotten away from what are our mathematical practices. The state of Kentucky and our National Mathematics Committee has put these 8 standards here for our students to focus on. These are essentially the key to doing math: making sense of problems, persevering, reasoning, abstract, quantitatively, construct a viable argument, critique reasonings of others, modeling with mathematics, using appropriate tools and strategies, attending to precision, look for and make sense of structure, and look for and express regularities and repeated reasoning. Now, as math people, if we don't really think about this, like, oh, I do that all the time, but do we really do that? And are our students conscious of it? So what I hope to bring to light is that our students have to be conscious of these practices, and as educators have to be conscious of these practices to get the most bang for your buck. Now, even though they're in order from 1 to 8, there's not necessarily a hierarchy of the standards, but we're going to talk about, we got some leading actors and supporting actors when it comes to our math standards. So let's delve a little further. Okay. So as I said, Kentucky thought these practices were so important that they put them on every standard cluster from K all the way through high school. They are hyperlinked. So if we were to, now of course we can't in this setting here, but if we were to click on that, it would give you a description of what these math practices are. And those descriptions are a little bit wordy, so we're going to try to put those into our own words. But before we do that, I want to this is copied from our state standards. I want you to take a few minutes and just read through their reasoning for putting them in there. And would you put one word from your reading that stands out to you in the text? I'm sorry, in the chat. Take just a few moments. I'm going to, but I can't just do one. I'm going to me, I love that phrase right there. Oh, apply and transfer. I'm right with you. I think we get a lot of the application, but we don't get a lot of the transfer learning that we're going to talk about. Developing, yes, because these standards will develop that math talk that math student that we want to. Okay, so I'm going to move right on. Thank you all so much for that. So the standards for the math practices are the doing of the math. This is where math happens. It's the key to high-level goals in mathematics, and it elevates our students' learning from that knowledge to that application, to that, that with that transfer thinking that was mentioned in our chat. And it brings rigor to the math classroom. And that's what we want. These mathematical practices cannot be learned in quiet classrooms filled with drill practice activities. If you noticed, a lot of our standards were built on arguing, reasoning. So that has to happen in our math classroom. And making our students conscious of that is one way that will happen. The drill and skill we have to not throw away with, but we have to balance it out with the thinking of the math and the doing of the math. Because if we're just drilling and skilling, are we really doing that math? We're just proceduraling it. The level of mathematical thought must be developed in a language-based classroom. Our students need to talk about their math. They need to explore their math. They need to discuss concepts. And we as educators need to figure out ways to give them that opportunity to do that. So, no matter how much content is covered in a math class, students are not mathematically proficient without that attention to the math standards for mathematical practices. If we don't incorporate these practices within our instruction, we're not going to reach that level that we want on those state mandated tests. So let's take a look at what standards for math practices really look like from a student's perspective. So this is what the state of Kentucky provides for us, and they do a really great job. They give us student actions, teacher actions, and possible questions. This is, I've got the link for you down here, and I've shared my presentation with you, so you'll have that. This is wonderful, but sometimes with those new teachers that we have out there in our buildings, it's new to our profession, as well as some of our older teachers, this can be a bit overwhelming. So I wanted to take it out and just look at what are our students doing, because what our students doing guides what our teachers are doing, and it helps to us teachers to evaluate what they're doing. So our first mathematical practice is make sense of problems and persevere. So the big idea for that is that productive struggle. This is what, and it has an asterisk beside it because this is one of our lead actors when it comes to standards for mathematical practices. Nothing happens without that productive struggle. The sense making, the perseverance in math, the comprehension of the question. Before I can solve the problem, I have to comprehend the problem. And being able to identify that important information in our task, formulating a plan, and asking, does it make sense? So I'd like for you to take just a moment and pick out one of these mathematical, when I think of mathematical practice one, what's one of these big ideas that I want to take away, that I want to remember? I always like to word associate a little bit, so we'll do that today. When I think of mathematical practice one, what is that one thing that you would like to take away to remember? Put in the chat. I love that, refining and justifying their work. If they have to refine and they have to justify their work, they own that work, don't they? And that's what we want. I love that productive struggle. A productive struggle, there's a fine line between, productive struggle and unproductive struggle, and knowing and giving those students the opportunity to have that productive struggle. I think as educators, we want to jump in and save the day, and that's not always in the best interest of our students. So if I'm walking into a math classroom, when I'm walking into a math classroom, this is what I want to see students doing. This is how I know that math practice number one is being put into place. Are they working with rich mathematical tasks? That's where our challenge first begins. Are they drawing? Are they using diagrams, tables? Are they making choices about their solution? We sometimes like to, funnel our students into that one way because that makes sense to us, the teacher. But giving them the solution path creates that perseverance and that sense of problem solving. Discussing the meaning of the problem, exploring other ways, persisting in efforts to solve challenging problems, even after they've reached a point of frustration. Being able to, okay, I've tried this every way I can. I know there's an answer and I've got to find it. We want that drive to build into our students. And we want our students to be able to say, okay, this is persevering. I'm using math practice 1. We want to put the language of the math practices in our students' mouths. And we can do that, simply by making them aware of it. So this is our big, even though they're not in a hierarchy of how they're placed, this is our umbrella that all other practices fall over, and all other math actually falls under. Because if we don't have that perseverance, we're not going to solve problems. Give me a thumbs up if you agree. So our math practice 2 is reason abstractly and quantitatively. This is paying attention to that quantity and understanding the relationship that it has within the problem. Counting and measuring, taking actions on the quantity and relating that to the text, being able to deconceptualize, take the quantity out of the problem and work on it, and then contextualize it by putting it back in to see if what I've done makes sense. Knowing that quantity has more than one part. It's the value, it's a unit, and it's a sign. So with math practice number 2, reasonably, quantitatively, and abstractly, give me a one word that you're going to take away from this one. This one also has that asterisk by it. That means this is one of our leading actors as well. We have to be able to look at that quantity and take it out, work with it, put it back in there, and then ask ourselves, does that make sense? Constantly question and evaluate what we're doing. Now, what do we want our students to be doing? When we walk into a classroom, how do we want to know that math practice 2 is being utilized? We want our students to be asking, okay, what can I count? We want them to take the quantity out of that problem and put it back in. Ask, how can I represent this quantity? What's important about this quantity? Pay attention to the information about the quantity. How does the quantity relate? Create diagrams and other visuals to capture the quantity. Describe it in more than one way and recognize the value of the quantity as it is in the given problem to the unknown. So this is what we want our students to be doing. And if our students are doing this, think about what all our teacher has had to do to get them to this level. So we really want them to interact with the quantity and recognize and its value. So our math practice number 3 is to construct a viable argument and critique reasoning for others. I always like to think about this one as, can I convince myself this is what I think? I think this, and this is why I think it. Now, again, this is not one of our lead actors. This is a supporting actor because it supports our perseverance. It supports our conversation for a viable argument or our quantity, making that viable argument for our quantity. So again, let's take a look at our big ideas and think of one takeaway when we think of math practice 3 that we want to remember. We've got to be able to convince ourselves and be prepared to convince others. How many times have you had students come up with the right answer and then you say, are you sure about that? And they completely like, oh no, I'm wrong. They completely abandon their thinking. We don't want that. We want them to know what they think and why they think. We want them to craft a convincing claim. This is my answer and this is why. And this connects to many different pieces of other content, our writing, our social studies, where we have to create that claim and we have to support it. We need to be doing that in math as well. Share our reasonings, know why did you pay attention to this particular part of the problem? They need to be able to explain that to us. And I love the last bullet, question themselves. Ask themselves questions. Get that drive to investigate within our students. I think if we could get our students to drive to know, hey, you can solve this problem in a lot of ways. You figure out the way that's best for you, and then you convince me that it's correct. So if we want our students to construct a viable argument and critique others, what does that look like in the math classroom? That looks like students saying, I paid close attention to this because. Students explaining their thinking, communicating during the task, not working and thinking in isolation, being able to explain, clarify, and elaborate on our math thinking, reflect on and justify their thinking. I love the middle last bullet where it says listen to, comment on, and question their classmates. Listen to others' reasoning. Can you comment on that? Can you justify that? And what does that make you think of? This classroom, if we go back to our original statements, how math cannot be learned in a quiet classroom, this standard definitely supports that. Examining different ideas and relating them to one another, seeking to understand, questioning, clarifying, trying out other strategies. That's what we want our students to be doing when we walk into a mathematics classroom. Standards for Mathematics 4, model with mathematics. I love this one and I've been doing a lot of work with this one because when we think of model with mathematics, we think of, oh, I see that in classrooms all the time. I see teachers with manipulatives out all the time. But just because I have manipulative out, does that mean I'm modeling with mathematics? When I model with mathematics, and as I go through these, I'd like for you all to put in the chat just what takeaway you want from math practice number 4 that you want to remember. When I model with mathematics, I want to represent that understanding. I want to show it. I want to think about mathematics and how it can be used to solve this problem. I want to connect this problem to other problems that I've had. How is this problem behaving that other problems have behaved that I've worked with in the past? What's it doing? And then, of course, I do want to use those symbols, those objects, those diagrams to be able to, manipulate the problem to solve it. I want to use math to find the solution. And just because, remember, just because there's a manipulative there doesn't mean we're modeling with math. So if anyone wants to put a big takeaway for number 4 in our chat box, that would be great. So what do we want our students to be doing in a classroom where we're modeling with mathematics? We want them to model the mathematical idea in a variety of ways. We want them to be able to analyze their drawing and talk about it, make it models for their situation, use appropriate tools. That's another way that we model with mathematics. Also, modeling with mathematics is using those formulas and equations and symbols to solve real-world problems. And I want to bring it back to that real-world problem. We want to make the tasks that we give our students make it meaningful, be meaningful to them, make sense to them. We don't want them working on problems that is not a real world to them, and that's a challenge. I love in modeling mathematics, we want to see our students simplifying complicated situations and choosing those models to use that will simplify that situation that they have. And again, it's one of our supporting actors when it comes to our math practices. Yes, you are definitely right. The real world application changes everything. It makes it so much more meaningful for the student. And, sometimes simply changing the wording in a task or changing the names of the students can make that problem real world to our class. So it's definitely something to think about. Go on and on forever with that. But we have about 10 minutes left. So standards for math practice 5, using appropriate tools and strategies. Again, that's another support. So go ahead and put a comment about that for number 5 that you like to remember. I love when I got to really diving into using appropriate tools and what we take for granted as what is a math tool. Pencil and paper is a math tool. You know, if we're using that pencil and paper to go back to constructing a model for a problem, that's a math tool. And I don't think we take that, you know, into consideration. Calculators, concrete models, protractors, rulers, compass, number lines, it's a math tool. Graphs and any technology tool, especially with this day and age of all the stuff that we've done online, we've got a lot of technological tools that we can use. The big thing for our Math 5 is knowing what tool to use that's appropriate to solve those problems. Now, what do we want our students to be doing? We want, we again take this for granted. We want them to be using coloring and shading to solve problems. When we go back and we think about those, very elementary problems where maybe students are doing a subtraction problem and they draw their boxes and they shade in so many that they're removing, that's a tool. And then it goes all the way up to our fractions and equivalent fractions, how they can also use color and shade as a tool. And I think that was a really interesting concept. I really hadn't thought about connecting that as a tool. Deciding which tool is best, estimating before you use that tool. Before I go to that calculator or that concrete model, I'm going to kind of get an idea in my mind about what the answer might be, and then I'm going to use this tool to see if I'm correct. There's strengths in tools and there's limitations in tools. Sometimes when we're using a tool when it's really not that necessary, it can be a limitation to us. We're choosing the wrong tool to use. And then using it appropriately and accurately is super important too. Our math practice number 6 is attention to precision. I love this one because we sometimes get into our head precision is the right answer, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about. When we're talking about attention to precision, we're talking about the vocabulary that we're using. Am I using the correct mathematics vocabulary to get my idea across? Having a sense of precision is knowing how close do I need to be in my modeling, in my estimating, to make sure that I'm going to come out with the correct answer. It's performing the math task with precision, absolutely. It's calculating correctly, absolutely. But it's also those other things of thinking about how precise do I need to be. So if we can put something in our chat about math practice 6, as we look at what would it look like for students. So when we think about our number 6, we want to see them using clear, precise language. And we want to see them calculating accuracy. We want to see them doing math tasks with precision. We want to hear them engaging in math discussion. And that again goes back to the math classroom, be a quiet classroom. Relying on precision to solve problems, decoding symbols is another way that we show that we're paying attention to precision. Labeling our quantities. Our quantities, we know that we said that math practice number 2, pay attention to our quantities. So 6 and 2 are connected, as all of the math practices are really so connected. It's hard to pull them out. And in our standards, it always suggests a couple of practices to incorporate with this particular standard, but they're so fluid that those are just suggestions. You can always add more. So our number 7 is a big idea. It's making sense and use of structure. And that's where we want our students to chunk that expression together. They want to understand mathematical properties and patterns and functions and make connections to our representation. Change the form to where it makes sense to them. So I love this one because as a mathematician, I do this one. I chunk certain problems when I'm coming to a big equation that I do, and I think about when we get up in our high school, 7th or 8th grade high school math, the equations we work on and being able to chunk those and make sense is a huge thing. And that's attending to Math Practice 7, just getting that language for our students to use. So what does that look like for our students? Well, what does that look like for our students? It looks like us hearing our students asking, how can I chunk this math task to help me? Does this problem remind me of another problem I solved? So if I have solved a problem like this in the past, remembering that structure, realizing that numbers are flexible. Numbers are very flexible, and I can use that flexibility to make my problem make sense to me. I can use patterns and rules. If I know that I'm looking for structure, I can use patterns and rules, and I can see complicated things as like single objects. That goes back to our chunking. When we look at that, we want to give our students the power as a mathematician to look at those big hard problems and be able to chunk it down to make it something that is simple for them. And realizing, what kind of problem is this? Wanting our students to know what kind of problem this is. So I'm going to take just a few moments on math practice number 7, and I want you to think, if you were to walk into a classroom, what would you love to see your students doing? What do you think would be the biggest takeaway for you like for your students to be doing? Add something in the chat for me. I think that I would like to hear my students talking about, what kind of problem is this? And that way they're recalling, what have I done in the past? How can I connect this to what I've done in the past that will help me solve this problem? I think it's important. For sake of time, I'm going to move on. She's got about 5 minutes left. So our standards for mathematical practice 8, looking for and expressing regularities in repeated reasoning. I love this one because this is a huge one. This is one of our big ones too. This is a leading actor, because we want our students to be able to make generalizations. This is where it's okay to use those shortcuts when we can identify patterns and processes, but we don't want to take those mathematical shortcuts until we can speak that language. We want them to look for regularities in our processes, look for sameness, find rules, and use patterns and properties to make math predictable. If we can just make math predictable, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing for our students? And giving them that power to do that. So I'm going to take just a breath because we have like 4 minutes left, and I want to take just a few minutes for you to ask any comments or questions while we're here with us in the chat. So while you do that, I'm going to tell you about on the next slide, I have in here just a document, and I'm going to share with you as if I am an observer, some of the look fors. I kind of condense the big version that our state gives us, and these are just look fors. It gives us our big idea for our math practices, and then what do we see our students doing, and how can we, do we observe that? They're pink because the pinks are our leading actors, and our blues are our supporting actors. And like I said, with many of these, you can see math practice 1 with math practice 7 with math practice 8. They mesh together. So that's the link to that. I want to leave you with just a quote. Mathematics is the music of reasoning. So that's my final thought. And I know this has been like a whirlwind of math practices. So if you could just leave me with a final comment in the chat box. We have 2 minutes left. So any final thoughts on our math practices? And if you would like to know more, I would love to talk to you about more about these practices. I could go on for days. I think they are key to the success for our students. It is something that teachers can easily, it can up our students' mathematical understanding very easy, just by, being conscious of incorporating these into my lesson. It's something that it's not always, I think that we do it as educators, but we need to be very, very intentional with it as to incorporate these into our session. So thank you all so much. I hope I haven't been too but a lot to cover in 30 minutes. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. And my email, I'll put that in the chat because I would love to hear from any of you. If you need any resources with math practices, or would love for me just to come and talk with you, your teachers, anybody, I'd love to be able to help. I'm a resource. So thank you all.
Thank you, Kim, for sharing with us today. And thank you to all who participated in this session. And I hope you have a great rest of the day learning with other administrators in the state.